Everyone. My name is Tami Kameda. This panel is brought to you by the Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance and its Yes on Prop 16 committee. We are excited to spend our lunch hour with you and appreciate you taking the time to learn more about Prop 16. Today, we will be hearing from the experts, Professor Jerry Kang and Hong-Mei Peng. The structure of our conversation will take place in two parts. First, the panelists are going to share their top 3 issues or ideas on Prop 16. Second, the panelists are going to answer questions, many of which were provided by our audience. And thank you to those who contributed questions. Before we get started, we wanted to recognize our many co-sponsors who represent a broad cross-section of bar committees and student groups. We are thrilled to have 10 bar associations and numerous student groups supporting today's event, all who recognize the importance of having conversations on Prop 16. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you our panel of experts. Ms. Hong-Mei Peng is a Director of Advocacy for Chinese for Affirmative Action, a nonprofit organization that has a long history of advocating for systemic change to protect immigrant rights, promote language diversity, and to remedy racial and social injustice. Ms. Peng oversees the organization's policy advocacy and community education goals. She has an extensive background on community-driven policy work. Prior to joining Chinese for Affirmative Action, she co-founded RAISE, an undocumented Asian American Pacific Islander youth group, and she also worked on immigration reform and immigration rights. Jerry Kang is a distinguished professor of law and Asian American studies and was the inaugural Korea Times Hankook Ilbo Endowed Chair for Law and Korean American Studies. He is a leading scholar on implicit bias and critical race studies and collaborates broadly across disciplines and industries on scholarly, educational, and advocacy projects. He is an award-winning teacher and most recently served as UCLA's founding Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, where he worked on building equity for all. So today we want to begin our conversation by enabling our experts to draw upon their unique backgrounds to talk to us about Prop 16. So Ms. Peng, I would like to start with you. We would love for you to share with us your top 3 ideas or issues that you think should be highlighted when talking about Prop 16.
Thank you, Tami, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank Esther, Tami, and Teresa for coordinating today's event and to APAWLA for inviting me. You all might be familiar with Chinese for Affirmative Action. We're headquartered in San Francisco's Chinatown, and we're a 51-year-old civil rights organization with a mission to defend and protect the civil and political rights of Chinese Americans and advance a multiracial democracy. And the work on Prop 16 is really grounded in our values of equity, compassion, and justice. We have been at the forefront for the fight for a more pluralistic democracy, and this is a democracy that upholds ideals where every single person receives equal protection under the law and is afforded boundless opportunities to succeed and thrive in the United States, no matter their gender, the color of their skin, the language they speak, or their national origin. This was the impetus behind our work on Prop 16. CAA's co-executive director is the co-chair of the Opportunity for All campaign, and the organization has been deeply committed since the campaign's inception in the California state legislature as ACA 5. After all, our name is Chinese for Affirmative Action. Now, on a personal note, as a formerly undocumented queer woman, this issue is near and dear to my heart. My family immigrated to the United States when I was 14 from Singapore. We resettled in Baltimore City, one of the most racially segregated places in the country, and I attended one of the lowest performing schools in the state because I was thought to be limited English proficient. Racism was a lived experience for me and a shared experience alongside other Black and brown children growing up. Racial disparity manifested in structural ways in the form of redlining, language inaccessibility, and disinvestment from public services. My knowledge of these challenges had demystified the false narrative around bootstrapping for me at a young age. Without equal opportunity programs that provided not just the pathway to being admitted to college, but also financial aid, diversity programs that supported my retention, I would likely not have been able to achieve my potential and bring the skills and talents that I have to serve the community today through my work at CAA. So when Tami, Esther, and Teresa invited me to share with you my top 3 points, I wanted to share some of the work that we have done in the community and gleaning on the insights within the Electrifying campaign and share with you 3 main points. First is that Asian Americans do support and are beneficiaries of affirmative action because it offers actionable solutions to redress racism and sexism in the United States. Second, Proposition 16 will level the playing field for women and those who are the most vulnerable in our society to create opportunities for all in generations to come. And lastly, this is the time for us to exercise our values. Equity is on the ballot and you can make a difference. So let's dive into it. First, there is this myth that affirmative action hurts Asian Americans and that we are opposed as a community to equal opportunity. The fact is that over 70% of Asian Americans support affirmative action, and our communities benefit from equal opportunity programs that stem from this civil rights landmark. We cannot let misinformation drive the conversation, nor can we take for granted that everyone understands what Prop 16 is about. We have to debunk the disinformation around quotas because most of you know this has already been struck down by the Supreme Court in the 70s as unconstitutional. We have to reassure the community that there is no Asian penalty, and this requires us to counteract the claims that affirmative action will result in some kind of preferential treatment for historically disenfranchised people, which for us also means rejecting the model minority myth so that we can free ourselves from being used as pawns when the civil rights legacy is being co-opted by assertions like reverse racism. I've been on several panels and, I've heard from many people who have been in this fight for a long time, many decades, from Proposition 209 to currently Proposition 16. They have all shared that the model minority myth continues to dominate the discourse to pit Asian Americans against other people of color. Affirmative action therefore becomes the red herring that sidesteps the structural, institutional, and pervasive realities of racism in the United States and how it manifests in blockading opportunities for historically disenfranchised people to achieve our full potential. We saw this in the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard lawsuit. We saw this in the DOJ findings about Yale admissions, and it reduces affirmative action to an issue of college admissions. The other reality is that APIs, Asian Pacific Islanders, have lost significant opportunities since Proposition 209 passed in California beyond the issue of admissions to elite schools. While there is an emphasis on the higher education conversation, the data shows that Asian American businesses have lost over $1 billion in public contracts every year since MWBE programs were dismantled in the wake of Proposition 209. Women and minority-owned business enterprises no longer have a fair shot at a level playing field to be able to compete. We know that Asian American contractors are winning more bids on public contracts in cities like Atlanta, where affirmative action programs still exist, versus a progressive city like San Francisco. We know that there is a need for more representation of Asian American and women in leadership in civil service so that our public systems reflect and meet the needs of California's diverse public. Correcting misinformation and persuading undecided voters presents a clear path to victory for us. Proposition 16 will not institute a quota, and it does not promote preferential treatment for communities. It does not prescribe any policy outcomes, but rather enables race and gender to be considered as one of many factors in the realm of public education, contracting, and employment. Local and state public agencies would need to develop their own implementation plan. Therefore, Proposition 16 is a key that can open the doors to remedy the gaps that we see. It releases our public systems from the handcuffs of Proposition 209 so that we can repave the path towards economic equity for all of our communities. Which brings me to my second point, which is that Prop 16 will level the playing field for women and those who are most vulnerable in our society to create opportunities for all in generations to come. The rise of anti-Asian hate incidents from COVID-19, Trump's draconian immigration policies that blatantly disrespects human rights, and the Black Lives Matter movement all point to the reality that we need solutions to perennial and intersectional challenges brought about by racism and sexism. From COVID-19 small business recovery to mending gender wage gaps, targeted approaches are needed because communities of color and women are A, historically put in positions to play catch up with white men, and B, disproportionately impacted by fallouts associated with our turbulent times. The challenge related to the wage gap for our clients who are immigrants and people of color, many of us women, is complicated. It's not just about the dollar amount that we're getting paid. It's about reinventing the economic system to take into account the multiple barriers at economic attainment and increasing our earning potential. These systems are inextricably tied to race and gender. We had a town hall a couple of weeks ago on economic opportunity in the Chinese community. We asked the limited proficient communities what they're seeing in terms of gaps related to economic opportunity. Many of their responses speak to this very question. We do not live single-issue lives. Language barriers continue to stonewall immigrants' ability to thrive when participating in vocational training programs. We have also heard that our community members see that they are being casted into entry-level jobs with uncertain futures because of their backgrounds and because of their English proficiency. And I participated in the small group discussion. Many of the moms, these moms who are from, first-generation immigrant families, share stories about the choices that they have to make to meet the demands given COVID-19 around distance learning, around workforce opportunities that are otherwise frontline and high risk. Many express that they have chosen to stay home with their kids to help them because they don't want to risk their health, to work in an entry-level job with no prospects of economic attainment or promotional opportunities. This is a reality, they said. This is just what it means to be a mom who doesn't speak good English during this crisis. And they're not alone. These stories really made me think about the ways that we need solutions that address the problems head on. The challenge is racism. The challenge is sexism. There is no proxy. And in the breadth of our work to promote equity and justice, we sued to uphold the promise of civil rights movement to have the Supreme Court issue a consent decree to ensure non-discrimination based on language and national origin in our public education systems. We have filed lawsuits to diversify the San Francisco Fire Department, challenged the hiring discrimination that was happening in the police department through litigation. And we know that diversifying our public sector and civil workforce is necessary to address the needs of our diverse communities living in the US. And we know that representation matters. Proposition 16 will facilitate a more inclusive workforce because affirmative action is the linchpin to a more representative civil service sector. It's also about breaking that bamboo ceiling and that glass ceiling so that we can challenge implicit bias, generate pathways to retain and promote talent from our community, and transform systems and structure to instill a more equitable framework to create opportunities for all. I want to wrap up by making my third point, which is that this is the time for us to act. This is the time for us to exercise our values and that you can make a difference. To learn that California, arguably the most progressive place in the United States, is living with Proposition 209, an outdated law that was instituted alongside the harmful and anti-immigrant Proposition 187, is antithetical to who we are. I support and am working alongside the Proposition 16 campaign to ensure that our communities are making a decision based on facts and data instead of disinformation, and open the doors to actionable solutions that respond to the call of diversity and provides opportunity for all. And we do this work in tandem and coalition with other communities of color. The challenges and barriers that I've highlighted are felt across different immigrants and communities of color across the entire state. If you go back and watch some of the legislative floor debates when Prop 16 was moving through its legislative process, you will be inspired because there were moving testimonies about how diversity was what facilitated state senators and assembly members' ability to be able to get where they are, and affirmative action becomes the through line for facilitating these opportunities. So for us, the Opportunity for All campaign is a rainbow coalition led by our co-executive director, Vincent Pan, Ms. Eva Patterson, the president of the Equal Justice Society, and Mr. Tom Sines, who is the president of MALDAF. The campaign has been endorsed by Senator and Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris and Senator Dianne Feinstein, alongside other federal, state, and local elected leaders. The campaign has received endorsements and engaged a wide range of civil rights organizations and labor unions up and down the state, and has foregrounded the leadership of students and youth. Ballots dropped, and this week is the week to act. Polls show that young Asian Americans are overwhelmingly in support. We have to continue to build this base of support and supporters through ongoing education to counter misinformation, persuade and turn out voters through our mobilization efforts, and I look forward to continuing this discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pang. That was very informative, and we look forward to unpacking further some of those very key issues that you touched upon. Professor Kang, we're now going to turn it to you. Please share with us your top 3 ideas or issues that you think should be highlighted when talking about Prop 16.
Thank you, Tami. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to thank everyone who worked so hard to make sure that this event got off the ground. Let me give a little intro about who I am and maybe make 3 brief points. Here's the introduction. I'm an immigrant. I came over when I was about 6.5 from Korea. I'm first generation. My parents didn't really have a lot of education or a lot of social capital. So I lived the immigrant experience. Like, I hustled a lot. It wasn't easy as a kid back in the day to try to fit in. I studied hard. I tested well. I went to Harvard as an undergrad and went to Harvard Law School. And in some sense, I'm a caricature of what they call the model minority. Like, I didn't have much. I worked really hard, and I survived and made it. And in truth, I could say no one watched out for me. I didn't have mentors. I didn't have sponsors. I didn't have, people who were trying to help me out. No one cared, and yet I survived. So in some sense, I should be actually quite politically conservative, but I'm not. I'm not so enamored with myself to think that it was only because of who I am and by dint of hard work that I got to where I was and where I currently am. But I am a realist, right? What I mean by that is, given my experience and given how I know people can feel very strongly about topics like affirmative action, I realize that we don't all agree. Like, we disagree about lots of stuff. We have different values. We have different understandings of the facts. We frankly have different impulses towards altruism, caring about other people versus ourselves, especially if you're really in a tight spot, when you're just trying to survive, when you're trying to just take care of your kids. It's hard to think about other people, and I recognize that. And so I want to share a little bit about me before I start the conversation, just to make sure that you know where I'm coming from, and not to suggest that somehow I have all the answers or that you could only think the way that I do. Okay, with that introduction, maybe I'll make 3 points. And the question A is really the question and answer is going to be the most interesting part of this engagement. Number 1, racial injustice persists, right? Racism is a thing. It impacts you, and it impacts other racial minorities, arguably even more. It's a thing. Now, in some ways, given where we are right now, I mean, putting aside the global pandemic, putting aside the wildfires exacerbated by climate change, if you just look at our cities in turmoil right now, in part because of the senseless murders of fellow Black Americans by police officers who are sworn to protect and serve, well, we know that racial injustice persists. It's clear, it's explicit, it's graphic, it's all around us. And we are right now going through a racial reckoning where society is being asked, hey, do Black lives matter? Do we care? Of course, racial injustice persists. And it's not only the explicit stuff. I'm an implicit bias scholar, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it turns out, given the way our brains work, even if we tell ourselves we're being fair and square, even if we tell ourselves that we're being colorblind or gender blind, there's overwhelming social science evidence that says, we actually pick in all the junk around us, like breathing in all the smoke particles around us right now because of the wildfires. And that junk actually sets certain ways of thinking within our brain that alter our evaluation and interaction with other people. And so for explicit reasons, for implicit reasons, for structural reasons, in some ways we are in the middle of something like a perpetual motion machine where, again, unfairness in the past constantly rolls forward. And unless good people try to stop it, the injustice of the past will continue going forward. I don't think I need to make too much of a point on this. Racial injustice persists. Your life chances are not necessarily fair and square. Who you are as a function of race, ethnicity, gender, all these things actually do matter. And even if we want just everyone to have a fair shot, that is not what we have right now. Number 1, again, racial injustice persists. Number 2, well, if we care about the world, we need tools to counter that challenge. We need tools to counter that problem. So again, if we think there's a problem, i.e. racial injustice, explicit, implicitly, structural, in every level, number 2 is that we need tools to counter that problem. And again, what could those tools be? I don't mean to say that it's a quota. I mean this very crude idea that whatever percentage of any particular elite position, whether they be law professors or CEOs, board of directors, I don't know, famous people on YouTube, influencers, that there has to be a one-to-one relationship between a California population and that percentage. I mean, we don't believe that. It doesn't always have to be one-to-one. And it's very clear that quotas that make very clear that there must be a minimum and a maximum, those are neither the right idea nor are they legal under federal equal protection law. So I'm not talking about quotas, but what we want to do is to design equal learning and working environments where everyone gets a fair shot. That's all I'm seeking. Actually, everyone gets a fair shot. You hustle, you get a fair shot at succeeding. That's what I want to build. And that's what I tried to do as an administrator while I worked at UCLA as a vice chancellor. It turns out your chances of getting a fair shot, however, depend not only on you and how extraordinary you might be, but on the environment in which you're actually competing. So it turns out critical mass matters. So if you're the only one of your kind, like if you're the only, I don't know, girl in an advanced math class, or, if you're the only Asian in a poetry class, if you're the only underrepresented minority, say Latinx, in a cognitive neuroscience class, the fact that you're only one and there might be negative stereotypes about your people, either being not that smart or lazy or don't belong or not especially eloquent or charismatic, whatever the baggage is, if you're the only one and there's a negative rap about your people, there's just a lot of social science evidence that it gets in the way of your performing. It gets in the way of your being great. You don't actually have a fair shot unless the environment actually gets rid of the negative stereotypes and also creates enough of a critical mass such that you could just be you, right? You don't have to be the Asian kid in the poetry class. You're just a kid in a poetry class. You don't have to be the black kid doing calculus. You're just the student doing calculus. And that's what we have to recognize. We want tools to counter racial injustice, but it turns out the environment matters. It's not just about you and me individually. It's about what the environment says, about who our people are, and actually the kinds of people around us, and whether there is at least a minimum or a critical mass of folks around us, or maybe professors who kind of look like us, so that we think we can get a fair shot. Number three, I want to suggest, again, part of what Proposition 16 is trying to do is just to actually give us that really important tool, to give us the flexibility to consider race and gender in order to build an equal learning and working environment. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be easy, but I want that flexibility. But the third point that I want to emphasize is that I just ask, regardless of how you turn out on this, don't be played. Don't be played. What I mean by that is politics are everywhere, and it's super, super tempting to trot out Asian Americans as really kind of, as poster children, as model victims for this thing called, affirmative action or race conscious, hiring or admissions. And all that I'm asking you and me to be is like, don't be a pawn in someone else's game. Like, we might agree, we might disagree, just that don't be played by other forces. And we got to look deep enough to understand what the game is and what's going on. Of course, it's super tempting to trot out people like me as the victims of affirmative action, right? There are lots of people like you came with nothing, you didn't know English, you went to Yale, blah, 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 and yet they're being prevented from succeeding because of affirmative action. It's a super tempting strategy. If you can't use a white face as the model victim, why not use an Asian face? It sounds like you're in favor of racial equality, and by emphasizing the Asian American experience in a monolithic and caricatured way, you can say, oh, the American dream is alive. You can just hustle and succeed. Why hurt these good Asian kids? But I think that is in some ways a political ploy, and I would rather have you keep your eyes on the prize. Let me just tell you what I mean by that, and we'll unpack it in different ways. Whenever anyone says you're being discriminated against or being treated worse or it's awful, I think it's really important to remember what maybe the most useful baseline might be. So I want you to constantly ask and answer this question. For any claim about discrimination, the best question to ask is, how are you treated as an Asian American compared to white folks? If you're treated just as well as white folks, after all, being white is the gold standard of preferred treatment on the basis of race. If you're being treated just as well as white folks, no better or no worse, I don't really think we can complain that we're being discriminated against. And that focus that I want you to always keep in mind, that you should just ask, hey, how am I being treated as compared to white folks, is going to be really helpful in analyzing what's actually going on. Because what we really chafe at as a people, as Asian Americans, is when we find out that we're being knocked out of opportunities and find out that the real reason why is that they're giving it to white people instead. Right? And there's actually lots of evidence that there still is discrimination against Asian Americans. You've experienced it in your own life in subtle and sometimes very explicit ways. If we are kept down so that white people can succeed, that just seems odd. Like, on what grounds would that be right? But if we as Asians are being treated exactly the same as whites, and it doesn't have to be all Asians, it could be some of us, depending on how we want to design the working and learning environment. If we're being treated the same, I think the presumption ought to be that we can't call that discrimination. We'll unpack these ideas a little bit more, but I guess I should stop. Again, the three big things. One, racism, it's still a thing. Wish it were otherwise, it's still a thing. It impacts you and other people. Number two, we need tools to counter that, to give everyone a fair shot. It turns out being completely blind to race and gender is not the best way to do it. You actually need to be mindful of race and gender in order to design an environment that gives everyone a fair shot. And number three, regardless of whether we agree, whether I persuade you, whether you persuade me, let's just not be played. Let's be sophisticated about who we are and what's really going on. And one way not to be played is to always ask the question, are Asians being treated better, worse, or the same as whites? That's going to be the question that's going to actually give great clarity in our analysis.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang. And we will unpack, like as you said, those issues as we go further in our program. So thank you very much for your opening thoughts, both of you. And we're going to turn now to the question and answer portion. And when we go through this, some of this is going to be asking you to kind of unpack some of the issues that you touched upon more briefly in your comments. So Ms. Pang, I'm going to start with you. And one area that I wanted to talk to you about is public contracting. You did touch upon this in your opening remarks, and it's something that I think I want us to focus on because we don't hear about it as much as, for example, some of the other topics like is public education. So I wanted to ask you, what is the status quo when it comes to public contracting, and how will Prop 16 lead to a more just and fair system?
Thank you, Tami. You know, the sort of status quo around public contracting is that women and minority-owned businesses, small businesses, are being locked out of opportunities, totaling $1 billion every single year in the state of California, and we're simply not in step with the rest of the country. Proposition 209 has instituted a ban on race and gender conscious program in California for a quarter of a century. And so as it relates to public contracting, state and local governments are prohibited now from setting up goals to include women and minority-owned business prior to Prop 209 or in other cities and states where procurement offices and city departments who kind of issue public bids for work that needs to be done on taxpayer dollars would be able to set a goal for a percentage of the work and public contract dollars to be tracked and awarded to women and minority-owned businesses. And oftentimes, these businesses are a lot more competitive in pricing and finish ahead of schedule. So really, all in all, it's a good set of public policy. Now, this means that, what this means for us when Proposition 209 has created this ban and prohibits race and gender conscious public contracting is that big prime companies that have the capacity, have the credit line, have the networks, have the resources to bid on these public contracts. They're oftentimes owned by white male owners, and they no longer have to do things like demonstrate a good faith effort that they have outreached and made an attempt to recruit smaller and oftentimes women and minority-owned businesses when bidding on a public contract. And so, Proposition 209, in addition to sort of these structural, more policy-driven prohibitions around race and gender public contracting, has also led to the disinvestment of equal opportunity offices and programs that were aimed at supporting women and minority-owned businesses to bid on contracts. And, if you read the sort of disparity studies that, were issued by Caltrans, by BART, these programs are extremely important and crucial to be able to provide the wraparound support, the technical assistance with paperwork, certification, small business mentoring and networking opportunities, all the way to helping small emerging women and minority-owned businesses to build capital and be able to expand and set up for success. Now, after Proposition 209, proxies were put in place in hopes that it would be a stopgap measure. In place of women and minority-owned business programs, small and local business enterprise programs, oftentimes referred to as SLBEs, were set up as these proxies. Now, this is sort of illustrating Professor Kang's point that, we have to really evaluate whether or not discrimination that we experience as Asian Americans is, in fact, in relation to, white, America is necessarily on par, or if there's parity, because we know that these proxies are not enough to promote gender and race parity. Asian American contractors are being kept down at the cost for the success of these SLBE programs in San Francisco. These SLBE programs and enterprises and businesses are owned, half of the San Francisco certified SLBEs are owned by white men, and making them beneficiaries to the proxy structure that has been set up. Now, there is an exception to this, which is, if there are federal dollars that are involved in any given public project, federal laws kind of come in and supersede Proposition 209. But really, the damage is structural and significant in California. And we don't even really know the full picture. I talked about disparity studies, but really, Proposition 209 has caused an all-around chilling effect that thwarted data collection. Public agencies are reticent to collect any kind of data on race and gender in fear of tripping up Proposition 209's prohibition. Now, Proposition 16, on the other hand, it does not prescribe any kind of policy that says, local government agencies or state government agencies have to institute any particular kind of programs. What it does is it facilitates the ability for these programs to be restored throughout the state. And so different municipalities, including San Francisco, have already responded in very positive ways by pledging support that, any existing offices of racial equity or EEO offices would take up implementation to deliver equity-driven policies if Proposition 16 were to pass.
Thank you very much. Professor Kang, I'm going to turn to you now with a question specifically targeting a little bit more on higher education. So we know that after the passage of Prop 209, the UCs have spent the last 25 years trying to achieve a meaningful racial diversity using race-neutral alternatives. They've concluded that they weren't as effective as being able to consider race as part of the holistic process. And the UC Board of Regents unanimously endorsed the measure that is now Prop 16. And you did touch upon a little bit in terms of your opening remarks about, what some of our diversity goals might vary depending on our context. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think our goals should be for the UCs in striving to achieve diversity?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, before I answer that, I should note that, again, America's in a weird place where repeatedly we're told, hey, you can pursue racial diversity. It's just that don't look at race. I mean, sometimes we hear that in Texas, we hear that in states like California. Even the Supreme Court states very clear, like, you can get to racial diversity. It's just that maybe we have to be anxious about actually looking at race as we get to racial diversity. There's a certain kind of oddness in the fact that what we all want is a certain kind of racial diversity. We just feel very anxious about using race, and that explains what's happening in states like Texas and California. What I want to do is I just want to give some comfort on why, if we want racial diversity, it should not be surprising that looking at race is the best way to do so. And it might actually be really, really useful in, again, pursuing a university's goals. to actually create a fair shot for everyone. So I'm speaking as an academic, not as a senior administrator, because that role I gave up on July 1. And here's the deal, right? I just sounded like one of our presidential candidates. The deal is this: the goal can't be, oh, we need one-to-one representation. So if there's 20% Asians, we must have 20%, faculty who are of Asian descent who study, microbiology. Like that, it's huge disparities might be an indicia that something weird is going on, but it can't be one-to-one tracking of some population pool. That's not the point. The point, as I said, is to create a learning environment, like a platform, where everyone has a fair shot. And what I just want to share with you is that there's a whole bunch of really interesting social science, much of it called stereotype threat or identity threat, that says, oddly enough, the environment around which you work alters your ability to perform to the best of your capacities. And again, that environment is structured by bad stereotypes about your people, as well as being really underrepresented. Now, many of you feel and have experienced what it means to be underrepresented. I've been underrepresented in many ways because I'm a law professor most of my academic career. So when I'm in a faculty colloquium, when I'm teaching at a particular place, like oftentimes, certainly when I started, I was the only Asian of a high level. So being a senior administrator, helping to run a large institution, again, oftentimes I'm the only Asian, and oftentimes I'm talking to a sea of very powerful, principally male, mostly white audiences. So I know what it means to be underrepresented, even in the university. And I also know that when I realize that I'm being underrepresented, that it might actually alter the way I actually perform. I can give some more examples, but I think the intuition is basic and makes sense. Look, if you stand out, if you're a sore thumb, then again, when you push yourself to the edges of your capacity and, I don't know, trip up and kind of make a little mistake, it's very easy for you to think, oh, I screwed up. This was really hard. I look around and say, like, no one who looks like me is ever in this line of work. Maybe I should do something else. Maybe I'm not cut out for it. And I think part of what we want to do is try to make sure that everyone has a fair shot at succeeding, regardless of who they are. And that requires us to build communities where you have a decent number of mixes of different kinds of people. Okay, so I think that should be the goal. Diversity has to be connected to a particular function. The function has to be designing an equal learning environment that requires us to have at least a critical mass in certain fields. And again, I'm not using this as sort of as a weird excuse to just pump up numbers of people I kind of like. If there is more than a critical mass of people who look like me, say East Asians, right? And maybe it's different for Filipinos, different for South Asians, but let's say people who look like me. If there's more than a critical mass of East Asians in the local mathematics program, we don't need to give affirmative action to East Asians in mathematics programs. I can accept that. But if there are different fields, right, like people like me, maybe in higher administration, in education context, or other kinds of fields, we need to be able to see the environment, figure out how we can actually improve that environment, and that does require us to actually be able to be conscious about race and gender. It's just another tool that has to be exercised responsibly, and frankly, our federal equal protection laws demand that it has to actually be something that survives what's called strict scrutiny. And when exercised responsibly, we can actually give everyone a fair shot. That's ultimately the goal. Can we improve everyone's ability to have a fair shot at succeeding?
Great, thank you very much. So the next question stems from one of our audience questions, and it's something I'm going to pose to both of you, and then we can take turns if each of you on it. And it does touch upon a little bit of things we've kind of threaded throughout our conversation before, but the question is this: what is the best response to those that claim Prop 16 will either harm Asians or targets Asian success? And Ms. Pang, we'll start with you.
I think in the spirit of Professor Kang's campaign of #Don'tGetPlayed, the reality is that the opposition is a small, vocal, and strident minority within the Asian American community that has been galvanized, primarily by, Trump supporting sort of factions in sort of creating this mirage that us as an entire community is anti-affirmative action and is against Proposition 16. Now, the challenge is that Proposition 16 is kind of technical and it's confusing, and you add a layer to all of the sort of legalese and technicality where proponents of Proposition 209 in 1996 has sort of hijacked this narrative of civil rights to promote the supposed color blindness to pit Asian communities against other people of color when it comes to equity measures. And we've seen sort of the trajectory kind of unfold, right, in the last 2.5 decades. Now, the strident segment of the opposition has been constructing straw man arguments that's rooted in disinformation, such as the misappropriation of Dr. King's quote to undermine Proposition 16, where, it's really we should be judged by the character, judged by the merit of our character and not the color of our skin. And, here it's important to note that Dr. King's daughter, Dr. Bernice King, is an early supporter of Proposition 16 and has issued a clarifying statement on the intent of the quote, which is a call for the end of segregation and striving towards a society where discrimination is no longer normalized, instead of just sort of glossing over the existing disparity and structural discrimination to kind of achieve colorblindness. You cannot wish racism and sexism away. Now, by leveraging a distortion of Dr. King's legacy and also spreading a lot of disinformation around quotas, those who are in opposition are, functionally doing two things. First is that it's stoking a lot of fear that has really been inflamed by the anti-Asian sentiment that has been instigated by Trump to pit Asian communities against other communities of color based on scarcity, based on, a sense of victimization. And then secondly, to prop up this myth of color blindness to spread this information around Proposition 16 and what it would actually do. The fact is, again, that an overwhelming majority of Asian Americans support Prop 16, and the initiative, when it was moving through this legislature itself, has been endorsed by over 250 credible, trusted, longstanding Asian American organizations across the state. Now, the polls also show that Asian Americans, especially younger voters, have expressed support for affirmative action, and there was a national survey that was done by AAPI Data. And, it's a research think tank that shows that this phenomenon is not unique to just California, but actually across the United States. And we know that the data doesn't lie. Proposition 16 does not institute a quota. Asian American admissions to UC has decreased as a result of the ban on race and gender conscious programs, and the gender wage gap is telling, where Asian women and single moms make about 60 cents to their white male counterparts for the same job. The reality is that our communities really need equity-driven investments to promote a more competitive workforce so that we're set up for success. This ranges from K-12 all the way to college admissions, all the way to paid vocational training programs, all the way to being able to create programs that facilitate leadership and management development and opportunities where especially women of color can overcome the multiple barriers, whether it's language proficiency, childcare, lack of access to transportation, so on and so forth. And I just want to highlight one of the initiatives that CA has worked on a couple of years ago through our Sacramento office, where we really partner with the adult education sector to influence AB 1111 to advocate for an immigrant integration framework, where we've used language access really as the proxy to be able to address issues of race. And what Prop 16 would allow us to do is just to be more explicit, to be able to just say, this disparity intersects at the sort of nexus of race and gender and class, and that two of those three things are not able to be stated right now. And so for us to be able to really use it as a springboard to think about the different legislations, the different investments that can lead to actionable solutions to innovate, a future that belongs to all of us. And so really for us, the opportunity here is to reclaim the conversation and chart the course of history for generations to come. And we really need to debunk this information and point to the data so that we are able to hone in on our values about diversity, equity, and inclusion and move this needle. So we need everyone to vote. We need everyone to vote early, and we need everyone to vote down ballot and yes on 16.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kang. And so Professor Kang, I will turn to you again with that same question: is what is the response to someone who claims that Prop 16 will harm Asians or will harm Asian success?
Again, remember the third point that I made when I said don't get played. I think it's really important to focus on harm compared to some baseline. So suppose I just start with the baseline, hey, are Asians being treated worse than white people? That seems to be discrimination old school, and we don't want that. Proposition 209 did not help Asians vis-a-vis whites. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that somehow Asian Americans, say, admissions to elite institutions changed and increased vis-a-vis whites because of Proposition 209. So Proposition 209 had no impact on how Asians were treated vis-a-vis whites. So Proposition 16, which gets rid of Proposition 209, will do no harm. Proposition 209 does not green light, a special discrimination against Asians. So it won't harm Asians as compared to whites. Now, but here's the second and deeper argument. You can say, wait, but that's a sleight of hand. I don't really care whether Asians are treated as well as whites. I care about Asians as compared to everyone, including all the people who might be included in affirmative action. So say if East Asians are excluded, then I care about Filipinos or Southeast Asians that might be included. And it is true that you might embrace a very zero-sum game. Like if I or my kid gets harmed in any way whatsoever, then I'm not into it. I get it. A lot of people think that way, and I don't want to deny that state. I guess I'll say maybe two things to that. One, it can also be in your naked self-interest. Like think about your own career that might be caught in middle management. Like why can't you get promoted? What is it about you as an Asian American that doesn't register with the people on high? Is it because of, I don't know, all the junk in our heads that say that Asians are not charismatic, can't be leaders, are not affable, cannot, sort of drive a team? If you think that that's what's limiting your potential, I mean, just recognize that that having the tools that allow us to consider race would allow, again, your managers, your firm, to make sure that your work environment and your promotion trajectory is fair and square. And that's something that we can't necessarily do now. So whether it's your small business not taking seriously, or frankly, like your daughter in a STEM major and how comfortable she feels as a function of, again, how that classroom is designed, these are all things that can be in your naked self-interest. But you can tell from my perspective, I'm not a huge fan of just making arguments in favor of naked self-interest. I'm not saying it's against your self-interest. But I guess what I'm trying to appeal to is, again, making sure that we don't have these kind of weird confusions. Look, giving opportunity to people, for example, certain underrepresented minorities or women in a particular context, gives them gives the people who are included in these affirmative action programs like a lot of advantage. And the truth is, there's great sort of academic research that demonstrates that the value given by increasing opportunity is not nearly as much as the harms inflicted by losing a little bit of opportunity for those who are not included in affirmative action programs. On net, at this moment, where we're going through a racial reckoning, I think it makes all the sense in the world not to have such a narrow self-interest frame and think if there's any chance whatsoever that anything could go wrong, that I couldn't possibly sign up for that. You are an American citizen. You are part of an American project. You and I have both sort of engaged in a lot of free riding on the civil rights work of mostly sort of Black and Latinx folks who, through blood, sweat, and tears, right, have actually given us the platform from which we can succeed. We have to recognize that, and we have to actually pay it forward and actually make sure that everyone's opportunity is fair and square. So again, not against your naked self-interest, but the truth is we should do a little bit more and think about what it means to give everyone a fair shot and to actually pay in our dues.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang. Ms. Peng, I'm going to turn to you now with a question. So from your perspective, why specifically do we want affirmative action that is race and sex conscious holistic decision making versus a focus on social economic status or some other race or sex neutral trait?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I know that that was also one of the questions that was asked through the audience. Now, I think that there's a lot of, sort of wonderings around why not class-based affirmative action. The reality is that that is the status quo, right? Like the status quo is using socioeconomic indicators functionally as proxies. And what we have seen in the longitudinal data as it relates to whether if it's public contract, public employment, in terms of, being able to effectively deal with the exclusion that comes with reasons of structural racism or as embedded sexism, is that these proxies don't work and we don't live in a colorblind society. And so racism and sexism, as abstract as they are as ideas and as ideologies, they kind of penetrate the structure and the systems that kind of create, right, like this forward propelling motion to exclude people of color and women from these opportunities. Now, we've seen this, I mentioned this before with the local, small local business enterprise programs, where if we remove race and gender from public contracting, white males become the beneficiaries de facto of these programs. And all they're using is sort of like a business income threshold to measure whether or not they should be getting, additional support. Now, at the advent of COVID-19, what we have also seen is that structural disparities is very, very much tied and immediately, intimately intersecting with race and gender. And this is so visceral that we need targeted approach. Now, across the board, LA Times to the San Francisco Chronicle, there has been a multitude of reports about how this targeted approach is necessary to help small businesses recover, because Asian American communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19's economic fallout related to tourism. And some of the, racist rhetoric coming out of the White House around, the China virus. But also, we're aware that Latinx, Black communities, and Asian communities have been devastated through sort of like health disparity, educational gaps associated with the digital divide, language access issues, and the list goes on. One tangible example where Proposition 16 can help, after repealing the ban on race and gender conscious programs, is to allow for state and local governments to earmark public funding to disperse public services, based on this holistic review, like what Tami had suggested, right? Like race and gender is one of the many factors that go into consideration of, whether if somebody is a qualified candidate or a competitive public contractor, but also that there are targeted approaches that is equity driven, right? It's not about giving everybody the same, but really helping make sure that everybody is able to participate in a level playing field. And so this is crucial to our collective recovery from the virus, but also just generally a healthier economic ecosystems. And fundamentally, it's just good public policy. The data tells us that, and California is one of the only 8 states in the country that do not have, affirmative action and equal opportunity programs. And we know that women are disproportionately, impacted and, can gain a lot if we were able to be afforded the same opportunities and if the playing field was leveled.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pang. So Professor Kang, I'm going to turn to you. It's a pretty loaded question given the amount of time that we have left, but let's see, hopefully we can unpack it a little bit. So you spoke about, the need to understand and look about, when we're talking about discrimination, understanding the context of Asian Americans and vis-a-vis white Americans. And one concern that I'd like you to discuss is, what would you say to white Americans who are concerned that Prop 16 will permit, quote, reverse racism? What are the assumptions or some of the notions that we should be thinking about when we hear a claim like that?
So yeah, it's a hard question. Look, it's easy to call it discrimination or racism if we think that anytime you treat differently any person because of some attribute called race, that is by definition discrimination and racism. I don't think that's the best way to understand racism. It is true that Proposition 16 will let us consider race. And it is true that, again, then administrators and other folks can try to design a more equal learning environment. But then you have to ask, what kind of impact or insult does that cast on you? Back in the day, when there was Jim Crow, when we said, look, these are white water fountains and these are black water fountains, we know what that distinction on the basis of race actually meant. It meant that African Americans were not equal to the status of white Americans, that they were actually separate and unequal. And that message was loud and clear in that act of categorization. That's not what is going on here. Instead, the idea is we want everyone to have a fair shot. Unfortunately, we don't live in a world where everyone actually has a fair shot. Like, we can talk about class, but even controlling for class, it turns out race, in part because there are different stereotypes, in part because there are different histories, and in part because there's different demographics. Race also changes your ability to have a fair shot. So if you actually invoke race to actually design an environment that, again, has to satisfy strict scrutiny, which is super hard to do, and that leads us to all have a more fair and equal opportunity, I think it is misleading to think that that counts as racism. That's not the goal of the program. We're not trying to go after white people. We're not trying to go after Asian people. It doesn't come from anything like animus. It's not the effect, because the effect is to actually make sure that everyone has an equal chance. And once things equalize out in terms of opportunity, then you actually don't need to continue these particular affirmative action programs. It kind of explains why Jews generally are not included in affirmative action programs in higher education. It also kind of explains why maybe East Asians should not be included in, I don't know, engineering program affirmative actions, right? We understand that we have to constantly tweak the system, but if the goal is that and the impact is to give, broadly speaking, everyone a fair shot, in what way does that seem like the grotesque phenomenon that we call racism? I think it's consistent with, again, equality under the law. And if you're anxious about that, just know that regardless of what happens here, you have a very conservative Supreme Court who will check everything anyone does in California to make sure that everyone's rights, equal protection rights, including white people's rights, are protected. And that's going to be a hard play anyway. So I would not be overly concerned about reverse racism.
Okay, thank you very much. So in our conclude, I just want to kind of circle back. I want to give you both just your very last kind of soundbite thoughts, closing thoughts on Prop 16. Ms. Pang, I'll start with you. Very last soundbite.
All right. Well, I think that a lot of the ways that our communities have experienced racism and sexism, it manifests in very different ways. But we know that the struggle for migrant justice and civil rights go hand in hand. It's no coincidence that, after Brown v. Board, CAA was able to champion Lau v. Nichols in tandem with Civil Rights Act of 1965. The Immigration and Naturalization Act abolished the quota system that centered family reunification and enabled a new wave of immigrants to resettle from the U.S. from Asia. So for us, right, we know that the community will benefit from Proposition 16, and the work ahead is to make sure that we're maximizing this window for policymaking to institutionalize equal opportunity. So this means, that the work doesn't stop after November, when we sort of are able to turn out and we are able to sort of make history together to overturn Proposition 209. It's also about making sure that the work continues to ensure that, there's higher education equity by having more slots in the UC system. It means that we're able to advocate for a more economic just system to increase access for immigrant women of color and women and minority-owned businesses to have a fair shot. But also, it is an opportunity for us to build up the muscle for us to be able to continue fighting for the next 50 years. Proposition 16 is a fight for our values. And this campaign is about inclusion and the belief that every Californian has the right to unlock our boundless potential and that our public systems must honor diversity and equality and equity. So I hope that you will join us in this fight to make sure that we are able to foreground these values.
Thank you very much. Professor Kang, your last soundbite or concluding thoughts on Prop 16, please.
In a minute. Look, I just want to talk to the people who are on the fence on this. And I totally get that you would love to live in a world where we're just focused on individual merits. Look, if you got the goods, then you should win. If you don't, it is what it is. But what I'm trying to suggest is that our individual merits never operate purely individually. There's a linkage between what you can do and what I can do, in part because we might be both Asian. That linked fate actually matters. And it turns out race does matter, even in the way that you or I might perform, in ways that are hard to track but are nevertheless true. So even though we want individual merits, it turns out you got to look at the entire system. It could not be otherwise. In which case, we have a choice to make right now. And I guess what I want to suggest is that even if you want individual merits to control the day, you have to recognize that we are all interlinked. And as we think through this hard question presented, I want us to remember that all of the fates of all Americans, including all people of color, that our fates indeed are linked. And in this moment, I guess, again, when the question presented is, do Black Lives Matter? When Asians can choose whether they perform as, I don't know, honorary whites or people of color to maximize opportunity or to actually constrain it and hoard it just for ourselves, I think this choice speaks volumes. And I asking Asian Americans of good faith to actually exercise that choice in a way that actually brings all of us together instead of emphasizes division apart.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank you, Professor Kang and Ms. Pang, so much for your time. Both of them volunteered their time so graciously to speak with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. So our last, we want to thank you all for joining us as well on your lunch hour. We're going to go ahead and put up a slide that will just give you some information if you're looking for further resources. You can see information for Professor Kang and for Ms. Pang, where to go and find out more about them, where you can follow them on social media. There's also links for the Yes on Prop 16 campaign, as well as the Ed Trust organization that has a lot of information regarding affirmative action in higher education. I know from the questions, a lot of people are focused and concerned about that. And there's also user handles for a bunch of our social media accounts, including ones from our committee that you can follow to continue to find out more about Prop 16. Thank you all very much for joining us today. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.